bloody door is open. Oh, Seven Hills. Out with it already,
exclaimed Ed Tollett impatiently. The new recruits have begun training, Lord Commander, the watchman reported. Ed Tollett was still getting used to being referred to in this way.
How many is that now?
Lord Commander Tollett asked. 27, and at least a dozen have previous fighting experience, the watchman finished.
It could be worse. Anything else?
Ed asked. The watchman shook his head and promptly exited. The ink scratching across parchment was as irritating to him as training the thieves and rapists being led through the castle black gates. He never thought he would be wishing that fat Tarly boy would make an unexpected entrance. Nonetheless, no word had been received from Eastwatch in weeks.
Probably 'cause them goat fuckers can't read.
Ed muttered to himself. He'll be tasking 4 literate watchmen eastward to join Tormund and Beric at Eastwatch. They'll deliver his message demanding reports. A shudder was felt just slight enough to make the Lord Commander's quill cease scratching. Dread then filled Ed's heart. He was wishing away his fear when a second jolt sent his ale horn skipping across his desk. Without another thought, he sprang to his feet, retrieving his sword from the office corner. He reluctantly looked up at the wall, half expecting it to not be there. Ice the size of boulders were occasionally falling down the wall. Through his office door, the winter wind instantly cut at his face. The feeling of his nose hairs freezing together was always the conversation starter with the southern recruits. He drew painful breath after painful breath as the men of the Night's Watch sprang into action. Ed intensely listened for that damned horn to blow, but it never sounded. Slowly, Ed noticed the lift rising, full of his brothers. He carefully climbed the icy steps leading to the elevator's platform.
How many are topside?
Demanded the Lord Commander. The operator then responded. 6, Lord Commander. We doubled the watch for the past week as ordered. 6 more are on their way topside now, he finished. Ed paced, squeezing his hilt, anxiously awaiting word that their world wasn't about to end. Shortly thereafter, all anxiety left the Lord Commander, for he knew this world was ending. The next tremor collapsed the castle black catwalks. Both men searched for stability as the ground itself attempted to remove them from their boots. After nearly a minute of chaos, the ground calmed, and the men regained their feet. Massive amounts of ice tumbled down the wall, but that was less concerning than that terrible sound. An awful, terrifying noise filled all the men's ears. Though the shaking stopped, the wall continued to moan and creak. The nature of the sound wasn't nearly as terrifying as what it meant, and what lied beyond this massive structure. Ed started barking orders to any man capable of moving. Looking around, he took in all the carnage. Men were crushed and limbs poked out from under boulders, and in some cases just sitting in crimson-red pools. The lift stopped short of the top of the wall during the last quake, the worst one yet. 3 men successfully reached the top of the wall by standing on their brothers' shoulders, then climbing the rest of the way. The creaking must have been deafening inside the lift. Ed watched from below as his men struggled to free themselves from the seized cage. Was it his horror or the bitter cold that made his body numb? Finally, after what seemed like hours, the lift's vertical beams buckled and gave way. Hundreds of feet of petrified tree lumber came crashing down along with multiple bodies on the roofs of the stables, officers' quarters and mess hall. Ed wondered if there was a single roof remaining on the castle. He watched helplessly as the bodies of his brothers were broken apart as they tumbled down the wall. "Orders, sir," a watchman asked. He hadn't noticed the half-dozen bloody men surrounding him, scared and freezing.
Gather horses, food, and any man that can ride. We're evacuating Castle Black.
The gravity of the words didn't weigh on him until he said them out loud. Eddison Tollett, the 999th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, ordered Castle Black abandoned. Outside the gate, 20 men and a dozen horses were packed. "Where to, Ed?" the watchman asked. "Shadow Tower, Eastwatch?" Ed then tightened the reins of his horse.
Men, Castle Black will be unmanned for the first time in our history. Hundreds of generations have manned this castle. Till now, We ride for Winterfell. We weren't attacked here, but somewhere else along the wall.
Ed concluded. The Lord Commander grimaced and stared up at the icy structure, knowing his brothers were still stranded atop the wall. Maybe the King of the North has some bloody ideas, Ed thought to himself, as his horse began the slow trot slowly across the north. Night enveloped the calm water as the Greyjoy warship passed in complete silence. Theon Greyjoy stood at the forward end of his sister's ship, the Salt Queen. The planned assault on his uncle's fleet thus far had been less than stellar. Most of his men had realized this as well, which had led to a steady intake of the remaining wine purged from Dragonstone. Still, they sailed west to King's Landing, to the Blackwater, and into the heart of their uncle's fleet. Soon they would lie before him prior to the sun rising the day after tomorrow. Perhaps this was the reason for his lack of focus. Either way, decisions had to be made soon, or not at all. Yara would soon be freed, and his uncle Euron would die. Theon rarely thought of his own father in high regard, but his life ending at the hand of his own brother would bring Theon's vengeance down upon him. For kinslayers, the drowned god would be exceptionally cruel, Theon thought to himself with a renewed sense of vigor. The problematic question was, how? And if given the choice between the two, which way would he choose? Theon knew this dilemma was the factor behind his restlessness. Footsteps were heard, and Theon spun around while simultaneously drawing twin daggers, previously sheathed to both of his thighs.
G'day, Captain. We bit jumpy tonight?
Exclaimed Osman, Theon's newly appointed first mate.
No more than usual.
And you? Drunk with bloody confidence at the mission before us?
First mate Osman grimaced at his captain and emptied his drinking horn in a single gulp. Theon returned his long daggers to their sheaths, keeping his left hand on its handle. This dirk once belonged to Yara, and Theon planned on its final resting place would be a pierced corpse bearing a resemblance to his father's murderer.
Your bloody uncle is no better than the cheeky pirates that prey on unarmed merchants, eh?
First mate Osman finished before he spat upon the deck.
He is capable at sea. We would be unwise to underestimate him again.
Theon finished realizing Osman was simply attempting to inquire about their assault's battle plan.
How'd you kill a cheeky pirate at sea, Captain?
Asked Osman as a smirk spread across young Theon Greyjoy's face.
Be a better pirate. At anchor.
Theon grinned. Osman grunted in approval as Theon slapped him on the back, and the two sailors then headed below decks on this moonlit night. Down in the hold, 24 ironborn sailors were well into the last barrel of wine. Their chatter slowly decayed away when Theon refused a seat and refilled his horn. He then slowly turned to address his men.
Men, we all know where we're sailing.
Theon announced before he was abruptly cut off by another.
You have any fucking clue as to what we're doing, Captain?
The gruff sailor asked, shaking his drinking horn provocatively in Theon's face. Within the blink of an eye, in a single smooth motion, Theon unsheathed his dagger, taking a single swipe at his confronter. The fat sailor slowly opened his eyes to see a stern but smirking Theon Greyjoy. The only sound was the bottom tip of the damned drinking horn hitting the deck, and the remaining wine that followed suit. The fat man slowly sat down without a word. Theon stared at the spinning horn tip in a pool of deep crimson red. Theon then slowly raised his head, grinning from ear to ear.
Brothers, any man here afraid of getting wet?
Asked Theon charismatically. Instantly, deafening cheers erupted inside the cabin, and the young captain poured himself another drink. Theon was developing an insane plan developed from that drinking horn. Theon's confidence was high, but his men would need more than confidence to swim into the belly of the drowned god. His men would have to believe that not only success was possible, but likely. His uncle Euron would not likely be expecting an assault, least of all from Theon. His greatest ally would be his enemies underestimating him. Given his recent reputation, who could blame them? His restitution would be granted on a knife's edge the night after tomorrow. That was assured. The road to Winterfell was just as bleak as Daenerys had envisioned. Endless white was all she had taken in for days as they rode from White Harbor. Still, the north had a certain appeal to it. Occasionally, Dany and Jon would ride on ahead of the caravan or to the other side of a hill. It was far and away Daenerys' favorite part of the journey. Once away of the caravan, Daenerys noticed just how peaceful the north was. All the sounds would normally echo across a stone floor or reverberate off of trees, but this was different. Heavy white snow blanketed every inch of the north. It muffled all sounds and gave its inhabitants a sense of peace and almost cleanliness.
Are you cold yet?
Asked Jon, and Daenerys simply smiled as she stared at her footprints in the snow. She slightly enjoyed the dull crunch it made under her boots.
Fire still burns, regardless of how cold the night is.
Jon smiled and pulled his queen close. She stared at him just long enough to be startled when he heard Drogon from overhead. Jon's embrace of his queen weakened slightly as the screeching became closer. Queen Daenerys was not ready to return to the caravan yet, and kissed Jon before he could protest for his own safety. Over the hill, a horse appeared, and Tyrion Lannister was clumsily riding down. He seemed nervous to slip off of his saddle in front of multiple monarchs. "My queen," Tyrion called respectfully.
I thought you preferred the carriage with Lord Varys.
Ah, yes. Lord Varys is as good of a traveling companion as one could hope for. Nonetheless, we've spent as much time sharing the same box as two men should over the years. Might we rejoin the caravan, my queen? I have a matter that might warrant serious discussion. I was hoping to include the King of the North for matters of military expertise.
Of course.
Daenerys curtly responded. She attempted to mount her horse, feeling Jon's hands on her hips. She quickly shot him an icy stare that even Tyrion noticed. Jon immediately knew that he had unknowingly crossed some line. Tyrion then broke that same uncomfortable silence.
I'll ride along Ser Jorah, at your convenience, my queen.
Tyrion shifted his reins and his steed turned tail to reclimb the hill. Tyrion was relieved that his horse had agreed, but he snickered at the predicament Jon had placed himself in.
I realize we are still getting accustomed to each other, Jon Snow. Do you think my Khalisar would follow a woman who couldn't mount her own horse?
I understand your need to prove yourself amongst your men, Dany, but you don't have to with me.
Daenerys' stern look was about to break into a smile when she flipped her right leg over her horse and looked down on the King of the North. She finally broke out in a grin she could no longer hold back.
Perhaps someday soon I'll give you a riding lesson.
Daenerys realized how that sounded and was immediately embarrassed. Jon bit his lip and was careful not to retort. Frustrated at herself, she addressed Jon.
Boldness suits a king in his kingdom, does it not?
Jon mounted his horse and adjusted Longclaw on his side before simply retorting,
I doubt the timid has ever interested the mother of dragons.
Daenerys was slightly shocked, but no doubt was impressed by Jon's aptitude. Jon and Dany rejoined the caravan to find Tyrion exactly where he said he would be, already in conversation with Ser Jorah.
Aye, preparedness is key, but I worry about the message it will send.
What message do you speak of Ser Jorah?
Asked the Queen as she trotted her steed alongside.
Lord Tyrion and I were discussing the possibility of retreating from Winterfell, if need be.
Ser Jorah answered simply, but seemingly wanted to elaborate further.
The obvious choice would be to fall back to White Harbor, but to trek for weeks to reach the fleet. Battle-weary. Maybe too much to expect without proper supplies.
What are you suggesting then?
Lord Tyrion likely was waiting for this question.
Might I suggest food and water caches be stored in the abandoned villages we pass through? Means for survival if we're forced to retreat.
Ser Jorah, what negatives do you see with the Hand's proposition?
No problems, Khaleesi. But should we even consider a retreat as of yet? There is still a wall between us and the dead. My concern is what message it will send to the men.
Ser Jorah suggested, and Daenerys understood his meaning.
I see. What does the King of the North say?
Jon grimaced as he pondered the question.
I don't want to break morale before the first trench is dug, my queen.
Jon responded, and Tyrion quickly retorted,
If the dead break through the wall and Winterfell is in their path, wouldn't it be more prudent to evacuate children and the elderly down this very road?
Supplies could simply be put in place for that reason. Retreat need not even be mentioned.
Ser Jorah suggested, and Jon simply agreed.
Very well. Sir Jorah, please see to it.
Yes, Your Grace.
Responded Ser Jorah as he peeled off from the main group.
My queen.
Tyrion stayed it up until Daenerys interrupted him.
Yes, my friend. You are no longer needed. Please give my best to Lord Varys.
Tyrion curtly bowed his head and trotted off after Ser Jorah. The road to Winterfell seemed longer than Daenerys had anticipated, but she guessed when travelling with 12,000 soldiers, livestock, wagons, dragonglass and 2 dragons would make any journey drag on. A small village was appearing on the horizon, and their caravan passed through without incident or contact.
Another abandoned village, my queen.
Jon reported, and Daenerys felt puzzled.
I'm looking forward to meeting your people, Jon Snow. But Northmen seem scarce these days.
My sister Sansa is likely to have called all the banners to Winterfell.
Your Grace.
Called a voice from a distance. Simultaneously, Jon and Daenerys responded. Jon, slightly embarrassed, apologized to his queen under his breath. Ser Davos, not realizing what his statement had caused, had asked Jon,
Shall we make our camp here tonight, Your Grace?
This will do, Ser Davos. Only slight fortifications will be needed.
Agreed Jon, and Ser Davos rode off to relay the king's orders.
We never discussed these technicalities.
I disagree.
Jon appeared slightly taken aback, and he encouraged Daenerys to continue.
You said I act as if I still have something to prove. And you're right. The North chose you because they believed in you. Perhaps there is enough room in the North for them to believe in more than just one person.
Daenerys finished, and Jon sighed heavily.
I certainly hope so.
His mind wandered to Sansa, the Northern Lords, and lastly, little Lady Mormont.
It would just be my luck to get stabbed again by another 10-year-old.
Jon whispered to himself. Cersei stewed in the small council chamber, staring down at a raven scroll her hand had just delivered.
Can we verify this information?
Qyburn sighed deeply, apparently assuming the question was coming.
Not in any way I know of, Your Grace.
At the very least, their past information has served us well.
The Queen exclaimed. Qyburn nodded as the city bells began to ring. Cersei's head snapped to attention, and she graciously and elegantly excused herself. The lioness had truly embraced the crown and all that went with it. As she walked out onto the terrace overlooking Blackwater Bay, she observed the Greyjoy fleet returning from Essos. Cargo of the most importance, Cersei thought to herself. Flanked by Qyburn and Ser Gregor, the Queen casually glanced over her shoulder.
Inform Sir Bronn he is to welcome the Golden Company and escort their captain to the throne room immediately.
Right away, Your Grace.
Answered Qyburn as he whisked out of the room. Cersei sat upon her throne in anticipation of meeting her mercenaries. She had scoured Essos in search of a contract that would meet her needs, leaving no stone unturned. The throne room door slowly opened as 3 men were flanked by members of her Queen's Guard. Captain Strickland strolled through the throne room and came into Cersei's vision. Cersei sat with perfect posture upon the throne she had claimed not long ago. The captain was a handsome man, hair golden to match his armor. His build was fair, and he was taller than Jaime, Cersei thought, though he did remind her of him. He was escorted by Sir Bronn of the Blackwater and the captain of the Iron Fleet, Euron Greyjoy, a man usually heard before he was seen. Qyburn spoke as the 3 men approached the Iron Throne.
You are in the presence of Cersei of House Lannister, Queen of the Andals and the First Men, Lady of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm.
Captain Strickland stood firm, feet shoulder-width apart, his hands folded behind the small of his back. The disciplined soldier stood out when flanked by his grubby counterparts. Euron Greyjoy continued to stroll up the steps to the throne as Sir Gregor unsheathed his sword as tall as the average man. Euron casually turned and faced Bronn and Strickland as if that was what he intended to do. This fact did not go unnoticed by Cersei, as she gave the slightest of eye rolls. Sir Bronn then spoke casually.
Your Grace, may I present Captain Strickland of the Golden Company?
It's an honor to have you in the capital, Captain Strickland. Tell me what I have bought.
20,000 soldiers and 2,000 cavalry, Your Grace.
I see. And tell me what of their special skills?
Inquired the Queen. Her question was matched by the tilted head of the young captain. He responded in a questioning tone to Cersei's dismay.
Your Grace?
Assassins, infiltration, camouflage. Who is your best man?
Demanded Cersei impatiently. Upon hearing the specifics of her inquiry, Captain Strickland stood a little taller.
You're speaking to him, Your Grace.
Well, that makes things much more straightforward. Tell me, Captain. What if I were to assign you a solo mission? If completed, I would consider your contract fulfilled, and payment rendered in full, without the loss of a single man. Would you accept?
Without hesitation, Your Grace.
Very well, then.
Responded Cersei as if she had expected his acceptance.
I have 3 targets in the north. The Dragon Queen, and my 2 treacherous brothers. The 3 of you will head north separately, and if any man returns with one of these heads, he will be given River Run. If a single man finds himself collecting 2 heads, he will be given High Garden. The fortunate man who brings me all 3 heads, I will then give you the 7 kingdoms.
Cersei finished ceremoniously, and Sir Bronn slightly choked at this revelation.
Your Grace, just so we're clear.
Sir Bronn was then cut off by the Queen.
I'm offering my hand. A marriage. 7 kingdoms to the man who kills all my enemies.
Queen Cersei shouted, almost annoyed. Euron Greyjoy stormed angrily out of the throne room without uttering a word. The young captain's attention turned from the distressed sea captain back to the Queen.
I also have a proposal.
Captain Strickland revealed respectfully. Cersei sat attentively, her head slightly tilted in curiosity.
More of a gift than a proposal.
Captain Strickland offered to the Queen's slightest intrigue.
What is it the captain offers me that I do not already possess?
Cersei asked boldly, and Strickland grinned before clapping his hands twice. The throne room doors then briskly opened as 2 Queen's guards entered and marched ahead of a half-dozen Golden Company soldiers. Queen Cersei craned her neck to get a better view. A loud roar was heard that made Cersei sink back into her throne.
There is no need to be fearful, my Queen.
Captain Strickland assured her. Cersei's sadistic smile widened as a fully grown adult male lion was led to the steps of the Iron Throne.
He's magnificent. What shall we call him?
The only name that suits a lion, my Queen.
Strickland paused for an anticipated dramatic effect. Cersei waited for his amplification patiently.
The soldiers have been affectionately calling him Tywin.
Then Tywin he shall be. The crown accepts this magnificent, most befitting gift.
Cersei announced ceremoniously, and Captain Strickland bowed low in appreciation.
If there is nothing more, Your Grace, I will send my lieutenants to your Queen's Guard for orders in my absence.
Very good, Captain, and good hunting.
Encouraged the Queen. Your Grace, responded Sir Bronn with a slight bow. The 2 men then swept from the room, and a flicker of a smile almost approached Cersei's face. She expected each one of them to die, but the possibility of even one of her enemies dying was worth all 3 of these men.
And what of the child, Your Grace?
Inquired Qyburn once their mercenaries were out of earshot.
That will be useful when the time comes.
Cersei exclaimed, and gracefully stood to exit the throne room. Outside the throne room, Euron reflected on his predicament. speaking aloud to himself.
The foreign fuck has no way of getting north quickly, and neither does the cutthroat.
At that moment, Captain Strickland and Sir Bronn exited the throne room, to which Euron would immediately confront.
I could save myself the trouble and just end you here,
Taunted Euron. Captain Strickland pushed past him without paying him the slightest attention. Euron took this as a slight, with a wide, sadistic grin.
I'll gut you on the King's Road, foreigner, if I don't sell you to a brothel first.
Euron spat, and Sir Bronn sighed at the scene he had just witnessed. Euron then turned his attention to the Blackwater Knight. He unsheathed his dagger and tapped the blade broadside on Bronn's shoulder, enunciating each word with every tap. Bronn refused to react or be intimidated.
What to do with you?
Taunted Euron, and Sir Bronn remained unimpressed with the sea captain's attempt at intimidation.
Working together might be in our best interest.
Convince me.
Aye. If I thought this wasn't a suicide mission, I'd have killed you already.
Claimed Bronn coolly while trailing his eyes down to Euron's belt buckle. Euron failed to notice Bronn's dagger in his left and was ready to make a woman out of the grinning sea captain.
You want to be king, you're gonna need them bastards to make an heir.
Sir Bronn laughed, and Euron returned a wide grin, almost impressed.
A long journey, 3 heads to collect and get back to King's Landing. We can create a diversion and infiltrate the castle, collect the heads, and we can settle up on the King's Road on the way back. Aye.
Sir Bronn offered, although Euron seemed not to hear, or perhaps he didn't care to hear.
Fair enough. Strickland's a dead man. If we see each other again, I'll warn you to stay out of my way.
Grunted Euron, slightly drooling at this point. Sir Bronn nodded, then offered.
Your ship or mine?
Euron again acted as if he did not hear him.
The Silent sails at dawn.
Shouted Euron as the men parted in opposite directions. Ghost had watched the horizon almost daily since Jon journeyed south. He realized the higher his vantage point, the farther along the horizon he could see. This went unnoticed by the suddenly growing population of Winterfell. The direwolf spent his days atop the broken tower in the Winterfell Godswood. Today seemed to be different. Ghost watch as the legions of soldiers tracked through Winterstown to their final destination, Winterfell itself. Once Jon came into view on a hilltop, Ghost leapt from the tower. His red eyes streaked through the courtyard. The direwolf would not be slowed from his master as his eyes were fixated on Jon as others came into view. Jon, Daenerys, Davos and Gendry were all atop a hill watching soldiers march through Winterstown. Ghost's tongue swayed outside of his mouth despite the bitterly cold air everyone else was experiencing. Ghost was 100 yards from the riders when Jon noticed him and jumped off his horse. As his feet hit the ground, Jon instantly became startled. The ground beneath Jon shook and a deafening sound roared from overhead. Drogon had landed between the riders and the direwolf, assuming Ghost to be a threat to his mother. To his surprise, his direwolf had stood his ground, nose to nose with the fierce fire breather. Jon sighed in relief and called to his wolf. Ghost immediately covered his teeth and relaxed his stiff neck hair. Ghost slowly trotted over to Jon as he patted the incredibly brave wolf. Drogon turned his head towards him in disapproval. Jon reached out to touch Drogon as to calm him and prove Ghost was no threat to his mother. Daenerys dismounted her steed and casually walked over to Jon.
Do you foresee the rest of the introductions going this well?
Jon then grimaced through his nervousness. He carefully chose his words, noting Daenerys' surprising optimism regarding the meeting with the Lords of the North.
Wolves tend to not back down when they should. I pray all the dragons are this kind.
He reluctantly admitted. She took his hand, to his surprise. Public affection hadn't been discussed yet.
You're nervous? Don't be. We have much larger concerns moving forward.
explained Daenerys. The side of Jon's mouth twitched as he squeezed her hand tightly. Once Drogon realized the lack of a threat, he returned to the sky under the curious eye of most of the inhabitants of the north. Jon took in his homeland with a deep breath. The land surrounding Winterfell was drastically different. The tree line had been pushed back hundreds of yards, and the southern gate was littered with tents and fires, livestock and grain wagons. The snow falling gave him a sense of familiarity in what almost looked like a strange place. This was a small piece because he knew what lay on the other side of the Winterfell walls. Judgmental eyes, disappointed northern lords, and one very angry sister. Perhaps two. Jon and Daenerys, flanked by their advisors, trotted their horses through the Winterfell gates. Jon dismounted and was still shocked at the sight of Bran. All the other lords and ladies of the north didn't interest Jon. For a brief moment he only had eyes for his brother. Jon squeezed his brother tight and kept his bare palm at his cheek.
I want you to know how sorry I am that I wasn't there to defend you.
The path you chose may end up saving this world. You made the right choice, Jon.
Lord Brandon responded stoically. Jon was slightly curious as to Bran's demeanor. Jon resisted to ask what was wrong as he remembered the entire north was watching.
I told you, when you were asleep, we could go out beyond the wall when you woke. You beat me to it. Someday we can go north and you can show me around.
Jon smiled, although Bran wasn't jovial. His brother simply responded,
I've had my share.
Responded the monotone voice of Eddard Stark's last living true-born son. Jon then turned to Sansa and embraced her briefly. She affectionately whispered in his ear,
What should I call you?
His sister carefully asked. Jon was relieved to witness her candor.
Doesn't matter.
Jon whispered back before breaking the embrace. Jon then turned and held his hand out to Queen Daenerys.
May I present Queen Daenerys of the House Targaryen?
Jon announced for all to hear. Sansa curtsied, making eye contact with the Queen. Then she gave a forced smile and proclaimed,
Winterfell is yours, Your Grace.
Lady Sansa, we thank you for opening your home to my people.
We are all your people, Your Grace. We thank you for your aid in defending the North.
Sansa announced as Jon let out a deep breath. He wasn't sure how long he had been holding it in.
Where is Arya?
Jon inquired, but before Sansa could respond, a single horn blast distracted Jon and all the others in the courtyard. Jon spun around to see a dozen horses riding through the gate. Ed Tollett and his black-clad brothers of the Night's Watch dismounted, and he caught Jon's eye. The brothers embraced, but a look of worry spread across Jon's face, for he knew only a serious sequence of events would lead to the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch riding to Winterfell during a time of war.
News. What news, Ed?
Jon's voice was low and worrisome.
Castle Black was destroyed.
The Lord Commander claimed as Jon looked mortified.
The wall. Tell me of the wall. Ed.
The wall's intact. Tunnel and gate too. But the castle ramparts, the lift all gone.
Ed reported to Jon's dismay. It wasn't the worst news, but the loss of the lift would make watching nearly impossible, as it was their primary duty.
An attack?
Dunno, no horn blew. But the ground and the wall itself shook so hard I thought it might fall. Most of our brothers are dead. We had a dozen men on the wall, and were sending up a few more when the lift fell.
Ed was now exhausted, but his last statement concerned Jon even further.
You're telling me our brothers are still stranded atop the wall?
Aye, been 2 days. We had no choice but to abandon the castle. No ravens survived.
The Lord Commander reluctantly admitted as Jon's heart pounded. A calm voice attracted Jon's attention from behind him.
Jon, are these men important to you?
Daenerys asked softly with her hand on his arm.
As much as family.
Jon proclaimed with an air of hopelessness. Daenerys saw the sorrow in his eyes that were searching for an answer. Daenerys hesitated giving orders, but Jon seemed to be searching for his footing in regard to this predicament. Or perhaps he was offering for Daenerys to take charge. Daenerys assumed this to be true as she then announced,
"The King of the North has spoken."
and Jon's head then snapped toward his queen.
Ser Jorah, do you still remember your way around the North?
The queen inquired, but she was already well aware of Ser Jorah's answer. He grinned ear to ear at being referred to as a Northman after his many years abroad.
Very much, Khaleesi.
Very well. You will lead 500 Blood Riders to Castle Black with all haste. We will ferry the men down from the wall and they will ride back south. Lord Tyrion, see that the men are fed and rested. Then coordinate with the Lady of Winterfell for anything she needs, or asks of us.
Yes, Your Grace. Lady Sansa and I have met previously.
Sniggered Tyrion as he attempted to bring any amount of levity to what became a very serious reunion.
King of the North, shall we?
One moment, my queen.
Answered Jon respectfully, and Daenerys obliged. Jon then approached Lady Sansa almost apologetically.
I'm sorry to leave so soon.
It's all right. Good to know the North still has a king. You realize if you die, Arya will kill you.
Death hasn't stopped me before.
Boasted Jon to Sansa's wide smile. Jon noticed Sansa's eyes look over his shoulder before she responded.
She's very pretty.
Sansa whispered almost to herself, although only Jon could hear her.
Please, not now.
Stated Jon like he knew it was coming. Jon straightened his back and spoke in a booming voice for all to hear.
Once again, Winterfell belongs to you until I return.
Until you return, Your Grace.
Lady Sansa's voice cracked. Without another word, Jon's cloak swept across the courtyard as he joined his queen. Bran looked up to Sansa, and Sansa down to him.
I need to be taken to the Godswood.
Demanded Bran, and Lady Sansa agreed. Jon then joined Daenerys at the southern gate. She wore a smirk on her face she couldn't help to remove.
Are you sure you're ready for this?
The wall was my home for many years. My queen. This is nothing new.
Claimed Jon with an air of humble confidence, and Queen Daenerys seemed amused at his presumption.
I'm sure you haven't seen the wall from this vantage point.
She exclaimed, and Jon finally realized what she had implied. He stopped dead in his tracks, ankle deep in the snow. Queen Daenerys then continued,
Come, King of Nothing New. My Rhaegal awaits you.
Daenerys confidently strolled through the Winterfell northern gate. Dothraki blood riders screamed past their Khaleesi, as hundreds of them set out for the wall. Jorah the Andal trotted his steed alongside his queen.
You've handled the Northmen well, Khaleesi.
Until today. I've only ever met 2 of them, Ser Jorah. Those experiences have set a very high standard for the rest of the Northmen to follow.
Queen Daenerys retorted, and Ser Jorah respectfully nodded at the queen's flattery.
Your prayers have been answered, Ser Jorah. Welcome home.
Daenerys smiled, and Ser Jorah sighed before he shifted his reins and took off at a gallop to join the Khalisar. By this time, Jon had caught up with his queen.
Thank you for that.
What do you mean?
Referring to me as King in the North. It drastically simplifies complicated matters with these northern lords.
I'm sure there will be more direct questions in the coming days.
Daenerys reluctantly admitted, and Jon instantly agreed.
The Northmen are loyal to...
But Jon was interrupted by Daenerys.
Yes, loyal to their own. Prideful, stubborn in their ways. Hard lands make hard men. Don't you agree?
It's as if you already know us.
I do. They differ very little from the Dothraki, as I've just described.
Stated Daenerys, and Jon failed to retort and seemed lost in thought.
You'd be wise to take that as a compliment, King of the North.
Daenerys teased, knowing Jon had grown used to her taunts. She sometimes grew mildly frustrated to not acquire a reaction from him.
These men chose to follow you, as the Dothraki chose me. If they respect your decisions, They will see what you see, and they will choose us.
Us? Is there an us?
Asked Jon, now returning Daenerys' taunts.
Are you bored of me already, Jon Snow?
Of course not, my queen.
The North will have a decision to make. If the North survives.
One battle at a time.
Jon had whispered. By now Drogon and Rhaegal were coming into view. Jon then remembered his first riding lessons. Show no fear. He approached Rhaegal, but the growl came from Ghost, who was still at Jon's heels. Rhaegal paid the direwolf little attention as he made direct eye contact with Jon.
Any advice?
Act as if you belong, and don't fall off.
Daenerys laughed, and Jon knew he appeared hesitant.
Jon, you are the only man alive to have touched a dragon. Rhaegal has taken to you. I can't explain why. Just go on.
Encouraged Daenerys, attempting to inspire him. Jon mustered up his remaining courage and gently caressed Rhaegal's face. The sound he made was similar to a cat's purr. Jon stepped onto the great dragon's clawed foot, then hind leg, and eventually stumbled onto its back. The beast shuddered underneath him and then let out a roar. This may have been in protest, not due to Jon, but due to the direwolf that followed Jon onto the dragon's back. Dany watched intently as the dragon took 3 thunderous steps and flung himself into the air. The Mother of Dragons quickly followed, expecting Jon to fly north immediately, but Rhaegal turned and flew low over and around Winterfell. Ghost let out a howl as the dragons then disappeared into the clouds. Jon was unsure of how to steer the great beast, but there was no need. Jon thought of flying lower. Rhaegal then flew lower. He drifted right, and then into a steep dive. Jon was in complete control to his surprise. Daenerys didn't think Jon would take to Rhaegal so quickly, nor her dragon to him. Daenerys followed on Drogon from a decent distance, watching Jon bank left, then right, then left again. She grew bored of Jon's growing confidence, so she decided to show him how to fly. She rose over him to a height of about a dragon length and put Drogon into a steep dive, cutting across the nose of Rhaegal. Jon watched intently and then decided to pursue. The Queen then dove below the mountain range summits. Jon expected her to pull up at any second, but she continued to skim the rocky, icy cliffs. Finally, Daenerys had Drogon spread his wings and glided along the surface of a nearly frozen river. Jon stayed at a safe distance, hovering slightly. He was undoubtedly impressed. As they cleared the valley, the wall then came into view. Jon was concerned as he saw no torches, fires, or lights from atop the wall. Closer and closer the dragons approached, and Jon could finally make out roughly a dozen black figures. Jon landed Rhaegal atop the wall and took in his surroundings. Daenerys landed approximately 100 yards away. Jon saw the men approaching and heard a scruffy voice from behind him.
As if coming back from the fucking dead wasn't good enough for you.
Jon grinned widely and felt back at home. Arya stood in silent vigil next to her father's grave. She daydreamed of the state of Winterfell would be in if Eddard Stark were still alive. She beamed at the thought of what he would say if he could see his children defending their castle, their family, all in the name of Stark. She replaced his candle and said a silent prayer to the old gods, as if they were listening. Arya walked along the crypt corridor. Her mother, her brother Robb, lastly, her brother Rickon. As she reached the end of the hall, she slowly turned and took in the scene. She wondered if she too would be a guest here before long. Slowly up the stairs, she came to the door that led to the Winterfell main hall. She slowly, quietly, closed the door with care, as to not startle the dead. Once in the hall, she could see a few people at the far table. Sir Davos, Lady Brienne, and the Hound, Sandor Clegane. Numerous hearths crackled as they illuminated Winterfell's great hall. Brienne immediately stood and approached Arya.
What were you speaking with him about?
Asked Arya, referring to the Hound.
How Lady Sansa was rescued after Stannis' defeat here in Winterfell.
Brienne responded with pride at her accomplishment.
And how did that go?
He asked, I replied, and he didn't respond.
Brienne answered simply, though she likely pondered at the Hound's intentions as well as Lady Arya's.
We spoke of you as well, and not for the first time either. I don't believe he wants to do you harm, now or ever, now that I come to think about it.
Brienne finished. Her eyes seemed to plead with Arya to show some shred of empathy.
I don't owe him anything.
Spat Lady Arya defiantly.
Perhaps he feels the same.
Brienne's eyes led towards Sandor Clegane, and then she swiftly left the room. With a silent strength, Arya strolled over and sat opposite of the Hound, not uttering a word. Sir Davos stopped mid-sentence when he saw the look on Sandor's face. The Hound stopped chewing and joined Arya in a blank stare. At this point, Sir Davos excused himself. Perhaps a minute went by and neither dog nor wolf blinked. Arya slowly reached across the table and helped herself to the Hound's goblet. She finished it in multiple gulps and replaced it upon the table. The sheer cockiness or bravery impressed him as he finally swallowed his mouthful. He reached for a pitcher and refilled the goblet, slowly sliding it back towards Arya. The corner of Arya's mouth barely twitched, and once she realized he noticed, a smile broke across her face. Sandor curtly nodded and took another mouthful of chicken off the bone. Without a word, Arya stood from the table and left the Hound to finish his feed. Arya walked into the sitting room to find Lady Sansa. She was in conversation with Lord Royce, and Arya asked for a private word. Lord Royce then excused himself and closed the double doors behind him.
You miss Jon,
explained Lady Sansa, looking up from a freshly delivered raven scroll.
I didn't expect him to leave so soon.
Lamented Arya, while giving up on commanding Sansa's full attention.
They were formal. She's pretty and she's...
She has Jon.
Arya's frustration boiled over as she had interrupted her sister.
She has...
Sansa reluctantly admitted as she discarded the scroll.
What do you make of her?
I'm not sure yet. The threat to the north is the priority. We need to prepare, politics aside.
No doubt that's what you should say. But is that really how you feel?
My feelings are meaningless. Jon has made that very clear.
Lamented Sansa as Arya walked over to garner her full attention.
Sansa, do you trust him?
Of course, he's our brother.
No, Sansa. Do you trust his judgment? Because there is a difference.
Arya asked. Sansa looked up, but any and all retort stuck in her throat. Arya had her answer. A problem for another time, she thought. Lady Arya then continued her evening tour through Winterfell as she found her way down to the forges. The steps leading down there took a little longer to descend due to all the bodies coming and going. Arya couldn't remember the last time she went down here, even as a child. There she saw Gendry, and all the smiths in the castle were following his direction. Dragonglass poured into the room by the barrowful. Molds were emptied as arrowheads and spearheads were poured into piles on varying corners of the room. She watched as Gendry pounded away on one of the large anvils. He seemed different. She looked at him as a child and saw a friend, a big brother. Now he just seemed different, not less interesting, just more. Arya wrestled with this, while staring off into a vague corner.
Milady, bit grubby down here for the likes of you.
Joked Gendry, and Arya then snapped out of her daydream.
Do not call me that.
Arya commanded in an attempt to sound stern and authoritative.
As you wish, Arya.
Gendry smirked through the soot and dirt on his face.
I just wanted to see how things are progressing.
Suggested Arya in an attempt to sound formal.
Progressing? 100,000 arrowheads, 10,000 spearheads, daggers, axes, and arming the battlements. It'd be a miracle to make half of that before they get here.
The dead make you nervous?
They'd make anyone nervous, promise you that.
You fought them. How many?
Enough.
Gendry responded, and Arya could see he was not looking forward to the next installment.
What happened to you after the Red Woman?
Arya inquired, and Gendry acted as if he didn't hear her.
If you get to the point where you want to talk about it, come and find me.
Responded Arya as she turned to walk out of the Winterfell forges.
The Red Woman? Or the dead?
Asked Gendry, almost shouting so she could hear. Arya then turned and simply said,
Anything.
Arya then entered the Godswood and realized the reason she set out this evening was to find Bran. She found him under the great weirwood, and softly called out to him, although she received no response. The Godswood was always eerie, but now the air seemed still, too still. She could see the wind blowing snow gently off the surrounding rooftops. She walked over in front of Bran to see his eyes open, still and blank. She admired the construction of the chair and attached carriage wheels. She sat upon the snow at Bran's feet, hoping he would return to her soon. It would have been an awestruck sight, though her first time at the wall was spent mourning Viserion and presumably Jon. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but now she stood atop the wall with the man she cared for immensely. Jon and Rhaegal had just returned from ferrying the last of the Watchmen down the wall. Ghost had decided to stay at the Queen's side and enjoy the view. Jon then approached his queen.
That's the last of them. The men are grateful.
They're on their way to Winterfell, then?
Aye, a few days' hard ride. It still concerns me, though. What happened here?
Perhaps we can scout along the wall and find some answers.
Asked Daenerys, and Jon did not answer her. She could see his mind was elsewhere. She then stepped in front of him to garner his attention, and Jon's eyes met hers.
Where do your thoughts dwell, King of the North?
The last time I was here with a woman I loved, it didn't turn out well.
I'm sorry. How did it end?
An arrow through the heart.
My first love was injured defending me, and then killed by a witch I naively trusted.
First love?
Asked Jon, and Daenerys could not conceal her smile.
I do believe you admitted it first.
And so I did.
Claimed a confident Jon as the two lovers walked back to their pair of dragons.
Do you feel like taking the long way back to Winterfell?
Jon calculated. Ghost accompanied Ser Jorah. The wolf seemingly had enough of the sky. The few hundred Dothraki and roughly 20 watchmen fell back to Winterfell, and the two dragons lifted off from atop the wall. The pair headed east, crisscrossing each other to ensure coverage of both the north and south sides of the wall. They circled over the Greensguard, noting similar destruction seen at Castle Black. Still, the wall stood as tall as the day they first saw it. They continued east until Daenerys eventually saw a clearing of the snow approaching Eastwatch. The closer she flew, mile by mile, dread had filled Daenerys. The snow hadn't cleared. The army of the dead was so enormous they changed the landscape from high above. Jon flew side by side and showed similar signs of distress. Daenerys knew this was an eventuality, but how did they manage it? As Dany pondered this question, she saw Jon and Rhaegal take a steep dive. Apparently, Jon wasn't waiting around for answers. She saw Jon emit flames from Rhaegal. He rained down fire directly in front of the leading soldiers to halt their progress. Once the army had no direction, they condensed. Daenerys followed Jon and took aim a few hundred yards behind the initial blast, separating about 10,000 from the rest of the army. Jon had circled around and decimated some of the dead caught in between channels of fire. Dive after dive after dive. Fire burned as far as they could see. Still, it wasn't enough. Jon rallied around again to start another dive. There were no horses in the no-man's land Jon and Daenerys had made. This brought her the closest thing to comfort as she could manage. No horses meant no walkers, no ice spears, and eventually their 2 dragons would arrive safely back at Winterfell. Just then, Daenerys heard a familiar screech. Though she knew it was not either of her 2 dragons, she lifted her eyes and was perplexed at what she saw. Viserion had joined Rhaegal in his dive, and for a moment she thought she had her child back. Joy filled her heart and tears filled her eyes. Surely 3 dragons in flight relentlessly bombarding the dead would extinguish the threat in less than a day. Daenerys grew concerned at the close range between her 2 children as they dove, and then it happened. The 2 dragons collided and knocked Jon well off course. He regained control and brought Rhaegal into a hover, and Viserion hovered opposite his brother. Daenerys watched from overhead, her heart pounding in her ears. The uncomfortable confusion seemed to last an eternity, but all sense of time came back to Daenerys when blue flames erupted from Viserion, engulfing Rhaegal. Rhaegal emerged from the blue hue, emitting flames of his own. The blue and gold intertwined and was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Daenerys took straight aim at Viserion, knowing fire would only distract him, as she blanketed her own child in golden flames. The flames provided the distraction Jon needed to retreat. This relieved Daenerys, since the man she loved was the only thing in the sky that could burn this night. Viserion gave chase to Rhaegal as the pair had entered a deep crevasse. Jon's control of Rhaegal was no doubt impressive, but Viserion was gaining on him. Drogon was larger and faster than his brothers, but Daenerys grew tired of fire and collided with Viserion, knocking him off course. Again and again, Drogon battered Viserion and finally pinned him against the crevice wall. Drogon's claws buried deep into Viserion's back. Once released, Viserion tumbled down the rocky cliff. Viserion regained flight and quickly disappeared over a summit. Daenerys had half a mind to give chase, but Drogon protested. Daenerys could not understand why, but it was just enough to let Viserion flee. It was the first time since the Myronese fighting pits that Drogon had resisted his mother's control. Jon and Daenerys then flew low and fast, returning to Winterfell. Daenerys knew what had happened. Viserion was no longer her child, and he now called another father. Under the godswood sat an unresponsive Brandon Stark. Arya patiently waited to speak to Bran at the foot of his chair. She continued to sit in the snow, waiting for him to return. Samwell Tarly then slowly approached the pair of Starks.
Wait, you're a watchman. Is Jon back?
Arya asked as she sprang to her feet. Sam vigorously shook his head in disagreement.
No, I came to speak to Bran.
He's away.
Stuttered Arya. This seemed to deflate Samwell slightly, but he likely had expected this all the same.
I've seen him do this before. He'll be back soon.
Reassured Samwell, and a steady silence followed. He began to fidget and grew noticeably uncomfortable with the continued silence.
Winterfell has certainly changed these past few weeks,
exclaimed Samwell, and Arya gave him a confused glare at this attempt at small talk.
So many different languages being spoken in the courtyard, and the trenches on the northern fields are quite impressive.
Samwell likely thought he was flattering Arya.
You're friends with Jon, then?
For years now, since our first days at Castle Black. He saved my life numerous times. Once I may have even saved his.
You saved Jon? How so?
When Robb Stark marched south, Jon fled Castle Black to help him. I convinced him to return, mayhaps even keeping his head attached.
Jon chose Robb over the Watch?
He certainly struggled with the decision.
Just then, Bran returned to Winterfell in a gasp, choking and breathless. Bran tried and repeatedly failed to speak. Arya bent over to comfort her brother and try to calm him. Samwell and Arya's worried eyes met each other. Bran regained his breath and terror filled his face as it then spread to Arya's. Bran tried to speak, but the panic continuously stuck in his throat. He finally was able to force out the words,
Sansa. I need Sansa.
Choked Bran. The parts of his body he could feel were noticeably shaking.
Where did you go?
Into the Queen's Dragon, Drogon.
Into?
I'm a warg. I can enter others' minds.
Explained Bran, and Arya was impressed, but not surprised, it seemed.
I've heard of this. It's considered a myth in Bravos.
Never mind that now. I need Sansa.
The calm now returning to Bran's voice.
The Night King attacked Jon and the Queen.
Why would Jon go north of the Wall?
They weren't north of the Wall.
Explained Bran, and Sam and Arya locked eyes. Samwell then nodded to Arya and proclaimed,
Go now. I'll wait with him.
Arya then took flight, and Sam then turned his attention back to Bran.
What did you see?
Jon was riding Rhaegal, and Viserion attacked him, but his flames were blue. The army of the dead is past the wall, at least 100,000 soldiers, giants and walkers.
So the Night King controls Viserion. He has a bloody dragon.
Exclaimed Samwell, falling backwards and plopping onto the snow.
Jon was riding a dragon?
He was, very well actually.
A true Targaryen, eloquent evidence, don't you think? Have you told him he's a Targaryen as of yet?
What is it, Bran?
Asked Sansa, now mere steps from Bran and followed closely by Arya. Sansa came around to see Samwell, his face now in his hands. She turned to her brother with a concerned look.
The Night King raised the Queen's Dragon and has destroyed the wall. Their army marches south.
Informed Bran, and Sansa's words could not escape her mouth. After a brief pause, Sansa forced herself to speak calmly.
Arya, please inform Lord Tyrion. Samwell, please inform Lord Royce.
The two departed the Godswood at her command, and Sansa's attention then turned back to Bran.
Bran, tell me what you know of this Daenerys Targaryen.
Bran was confused, but complied. He spoke of Viserys, Drogo, Daario, and the Tarleys. Once Sansa was satisfied with this information, she interrupted Bran.
You know I heard you and Sam. Who is the other Targaryen?
Asked Sansa, and Bran stared off into the distance.
Brandon Stark!
She shouted, and Bran considered looking into the future. No doubt this conversation would alter it greatly.
It's nothing, really.
Lied Bran, though Sansa seemed to not take him at his word.
Jon, you were talking about Jon, weren't you? He left Winterfell riding a damn dragon, Bran.
Shouted Sansa, pleading with Bran to be honest with her.
No, it's not Jon.
Bran lied again, now refusing to look at Sansa. Instead, he glared at his folded hands in his lap, and this did not go unnoticed by his sister.
I remember Mother. I could never lie to her. She always knew when we were lying, especially you. I remember Mother claiming you always looked at your feet when you lie.
Bran now knew there was no avoiding it. He told Sansa of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark, the royal annulment and a secret wedding. He spoke of the death of their aunt, the birth of a king, and a secret taken to their father's grave. Sansa convinced Bran not to speak to Jon for the good of their house.
What we decide here and now, little brother, could determine whether or not the North survives.
Sansa and Bran left the Godswood in search of Samwell Tarly, for he was the only other person alive who knew the truth of their brother. Cousin, actually, thought Sansa to herself. Sansa found Samwell Tarly in the main hall and invited him into the war room with Bran. A table stood between them as it showed their defensive positions mustered all around Winterfell. A 3-tiered trench system on the northern fields, and a third of the table was covered by the army of the dead. Sam paid it ample attention until Sansa broke the silence.
Sam, I've spoken with Bran and he told me about Jon.
It's true, all of it.
You understand how this complicates matters, don't you?
I believe so.
My concern is for Jon. His queen will see him as a rival. Will you help me keep him safe?
Sansa inquired, which made Samwell quite nervous. Perhaps Jon was a threat to Daenerys, and Sam personally knew how Daenerys dealt with threats.
What do you propose?
Asked Samwell after regaining his composure.
Nothing. We say nothing. We do nothing. We deal with the army of the dead and support Daenerys' claim to the Seven Kingdoms.
Pleaded Sansa, and Samwell stared at the floor deep in thought. He lifted his head, clearly distraught, and nodded his chubby face. Sansa walked over to Sam and took his hands in hers.
I need to hear you say it, Samwell Tarly.
I swear it. I'll take Jon's secret to my grave.
Swore Samwell, his confidence now growing.
He's saved my life so many times. I owe him this.
Cried Samwell. It was more to himself rather than to the Lady of Winterfell.
There is something else. It concerns your father and brother.
Lamented Sansa, and Samwell hastily took a seat. Sansa and Bran exchanged looks as a horn blast sounded, announcing returning riders.
Winterfell has taken on some new traditions.
Bran noticed, and the three continued their conversation despite the hundreds of Dothraki, watchmen, and a direwolf bursting into the courtyard. The returning watchmen were greeted as heroes upon entering Winterfell. Lord Glover met the watchmen with skins of ale. He asked about the Wall and Queen Daenerys. The watchmen were more than flattering in regards to the Queen. The Stark sisters and Samwell Tarly greeted the watchman. "Oi, Tarly, no need to cry over it. Can't imagine you'd ever miss that old black shithouse," said one of Sam's brothers. Sam had to force a smile.
I'm just glad to see you lot made it out.
Samwell revealed as Lady Mormont broke up the reunion and demanded news about Jon Snow. She received no response. Suddenly screeches were heard overhead as the pair of dragons circled the castle. The dragons landed in the Godswood, and all the northern lords watched as Jon and Dany embraced after their battle.
You were amazing. Aegon himself would have been impressed.
Jon flattered his queen as they walked through the courtyard.
You flew well. Are you all right?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm worried about you. You had to battle your own child.
My child is dead. It's easier that way.
Daenerys claimed. Sansa rushed out to greet them, as did the bright white direwolf.
Your Grace,
she exclaimed. Both Jon and Dany responded, "Lady Sansa," and they exchanged awkward looks again.
Sansa, we need to hold court. Please gather all the lords, ladies, knights, and generals into the main hall as soon as possible.
Jon finished, and Lady Sansa appeared concerned.
what is it? What has happened?
Everything we feared,
explained Jon softly. Jon thought Sansa looked as if she had expected this.
Either way, you're not getting out of the Godswood without seeing Arya.
Jon looked over Sansa's shoulder to see Arya with tears in her eyes.
Queen Daenerys, may I offer you some refreshment before we hold court?
That would be welcomed, Lady Sansa.
The two ladies left Jon and Arya to themselves. Arya ran and embraced her brother. Too many years had passed. After what seemed like an hour, Jon broke the embrace first and admired the woman before him.
You left Winterfell to join the Watch. You return a king riding a dragon. If Father could see you now.
I assure you, I've lost more than I gained.
Claimed Jon with half a smile.
You look well. Gained a few scars, I see.
And some others that you can't see.
Finished Arya in a somber tone.
Likewise.
Exclaimed Jon stoically.
Did Needle serve you well?
It did, many times over.
Admitted Arya. She wasn't proud of her actions, but she owned them outright.
Anyone we know?
Lord Walder Frey and all his sons.
Arya muttered, though she was proud of that one particular kill.
I see. Any others?
A modest few.
Answered Arya and Jon, then changed the subject.
You look worried. There will be a lot of that going on here moving forward. We have a lot to prepare for, and I may need your help with Sansa.
She knows what she's doing, Jon. We'd both be wise to listen to her. She learned from the best.
And who would that be?
Asked Jon with a genuine curiosity on his breath.
Cersei Lannister.
Retorted Arya as the two departed the Godswood, brother's arm around his sister's shoulders. Samwell Tarly was waiting for the right moment to interrupt, and he could wait no longer. Jon could see his conflicted face. He excused himself from his sister and greeted his brother. Jon embraced Sam and then spoke to him.
So can I call you Maester Samwell?
Asked Jon, and Samwell silently shook his head.
Not yet, I'm afraid. Is there somewhere we can talk?
Jon silently nodded, taking in Samwell's body language.
I know of a place. Follow me.
He added, and Jon led Sam down to the crypts. The two walked along the corridors and neither of them spoke.
So, what is it?
Samwell then stopped in front of Eddard Stark's grave. Jon noticed Sam deep in thought, staring at what remained of his father. Samwell then broke the silence.
My father, my brother. She killed them.
Samwell cried, "Who?" Jon thought of asking, although he already knew. Why else would Sam need a private word if it wasn't his queen who killed them?
The Dragon Queen. During the Battle of Golden Road, they surrendered and she burned them alive.
Claimed Samwell, now openly weeping.
We're at war, Sam. I'm sure she had her reasons.
Sam's sobs slowly faded. Jon could tell it was turning to anger. This almost frightened Jon, as he had never seen Sam angry. Sam has had many reasons to be angry, Jon thought, but this put him over the edge.
War doesn't excuse murder. Jon, you know this better than anyone.
Claimed Samwell, and Jon knew his only retort was logically simple. He could only offer Sam a small amount of comfort, if any.
She is our queen. It is not our place to question her decisions.
Jon admitted, and Samwell remained unimpressed.
If you think your family was done wrong, discuss the issue with Lord Tyrion, her hand. He's a good man. Despite the name,
explained Jon, and Samwell's face softened.
I'm sorry. It's been...
You're not the first to lose family in this war. All we can do now is stop this from happening again.
You swore her fealty?
Yes, I bent the knee, but not many people are aware.
Explained Jon, as the men's voices reverberated off the walls and ceilings. The only noise now was the crackling of the torches that lit the passageways.
It's good to see you again, Sam.
You as well,
admitted Sam as they started walking up the stone steps to the main hall. Queen Daenerys entered the library behind the main hall, and Lady Sansa quickly followed. Nearly 24 candles dimly lit the room and the war table within it. Queen Daenerys meekly studied the battle plan. She thought of how much this table would have confused her in the innocent days she resided in Pentos. A child bride no longer, she thought. No longer the little sister of the last dragon. She was Daenerys Stormborn, the rightful queen of Westeros, and the love of the king of one of her kingdoms, a thought not lost on his sister, who stood before her.
I wanted to formally thank you for bringing your forces to our aid. The North are proud people, Your Grace, not accustomed to asking for help.
I've grown accustomed to people such as Northerners. Pride is not exclusive to geography.
May we sit, Your Grace?
Please, Lady Sansa. This is your home. I am nothing more than your honored guest.
But you're much more than that, aren't you?
Asked Sansa while taking a seat. The Queen was at a loss for words, though she did not blink. Her response was stern, yet soft.
I assume you're referring to Jon?
More or less, Your Grace.
Less than your brother, you would not have mentioned your troubles. More than your brother. You must be referring to the North as a whole.
I am, Your Grace.
Very well, Lady Sansa. What are your concerns?
Asked Queen Daenerys curtly, still slightly annoyed at the Lady of Winterfell.
The North has suffered atrocities from southern rulers, Your Grace. Specifically my father, grandfather, and uncle.
If daughters were held accountable for their father's crimes, it is very unlikely that either of us would be here having a conversation about them.
Explained Daenerys, now matching Sansa's coldness.
The Northern Lords will not bow to a southern ruler, Your Grace. You've convinced Jon, which means you've convinced me, my queen. If the North survives the Great War, you may be better off to then abandon us, leaving us to the dead, then installing a loyal warden. But what would Jon think? Your love for him shows. So the North's survival is important to both of you.
Sansa had then reached her conclusion. Daenerys digested this, clearly attempting to remain civil in this conversation-turned-negotiation.
So you would think I would grant the North its independence due to a few stubborn lords? Pardon my disbelief, Lady Sansa, but your brother described you as intelligent.
Retorted the stern-faced Dragon Queen, and Lady Sansa remained cold and stoic. Almost satisfied, Daenerys thought to herself.
There is something else. I wouldn't have sought an audience with demands of the Mother of Dragons without it.
Get on with it. Go on, then.
You are aware of my brother Bran, and his visions.
Little faith I put in visions, Lady Sansa. You'd be wise to do the same.
Is that how you felt about your vision of Khal Drogo, and your son north of the Wall?
Demanded Lady Sansa, almost shouting. Daenerys stood so fast her chair screeched along the stone floor.
How could you know?
Queen Daenerys demanded before Lady Sansa's attempted interruption.
I know of Drogo's demise, Viserys' cruelty, and Arya's love for you.
Simple knowledge of my past will not be enough to buy the North, Lady Stark.
Of course not. But has this knowledge convinced you of Bran's accuracy?
They have my attention for the time being.
What I'm about to tell you will be hard to believe. Please be certain that I take no pleasure in revealing this to you.
Get on with it.
Stated the impatient Queen, and Sansa took a deep breath to steady herself before continuing.
Your brother Rhaegar took my Aunt Lyanna, causing the rebellion. He annulled his marriage to Elia Martell and married Lyanna after your father was killed. And Rhaegar fell at the Trident. A king was born in Dawn.
Daenerys listened intently, but was failing to see the significance.
A king born to Lyanna Stark. She died on her birthing bed. But just before that, she handed her son to her brother, my father, Eddard Stark. He raised him as his bastard son and took this secret to his grave.
Daenerys then collapsed back into her chair.
It's impossible. No, that's not possible. This cannot be.
The Queen muttered, and after a long silence, Lady Sansa then continued.
It's all straightforward. I am willing to keep Jon's secret. We will defeat the army of the dead. Cersei will be overthrown, or preferably killed, and you will reign as Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, first of her name, and the Lady of the Six Kingdoms.
Sansa thought to continue, but paused just long enough to allow the stewing, shocked monarch to interrupt. To Sansa's surprise, Daenerys declined, and so Sansa continued.
Aegon Targaryen will remain unaware of his birthright.
His name is Aegon?
Asked Daenerys, clearly in shock over the situation.
Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name.
I see. Well, it seems your time in King's Landing has served you well, Lady Sansa. It seems I have no choice. I must agree to your terms.
Daenerys paused and stood as gracefully as she could muster.
I must warn you, Lady Stark. Ultimatums rarely work out for the one making them.
Finished Daenerys as Sansa slowly rose from her seat.
Your Grace.
I've traveled to many cities. Each and every time I left more powerful than when I arrived. My past is littered with the bones of the men that have underestimated me. Winterfell will be no different.
Finished the Queen. Daenerys then exited the library, fearing that she was the one doing the underestimating. Suddenly she was no longer the mother of dragons. nor the queen of tens of thousands of soldiers. She was once again a powerless child bride, bought and sold. The queen noticed the northern lords gathering in the main hall. Her eyes scanned the crowd for her hand, Lord Tyrion. She spotted him at the high table alongside Bran and Sansa Stark. Queen Daenerys then elegantly took her seat next to her hand, Lord Tyrion. Her words just a little more than a whisper.
No matter what is said in this hall, you will agree with me.
Ordered the queen, and a look of worry spread across the hand's face.
Of course, my queen. Any reason in particular?
We will speak in private immediately following court. Now please inform Ser Jorah to do the same.
Right away, Your Grace.
Responded Lord Tyrion as he departed the high table to speak to Ser Jorah. King Jon then took his seat next to the queen. Jon and Dany's eyes met for just a moment before he scanned the crowded hall, finally locating Ser Davos. He motioned to the Onion Knight to take his place, for they were to begin. Queen Daenerys' eyes remained fixated on Jon as he spoke. She was trying to work out her confusion. His nose seemed slightly like Viserys's, his hair as well, though a darker color. She remembered Sir Barristan's stories of her brother Rhaegar. Her opinion of her brother she had never met remained high for this reason. Then it dawned on her. She was now convinced of Jon's lineage. Jon was a good man. She knew this. Daenerys knew in this world. These men were few. She was convinced the reason Jon was a good man was because Rhaegar was also. Or perhaps this proved Rhaegar was a good man because Jon obviously was. Whichever way it worked, she wasn't sure. Not that it mattered. While dizzy in her daydream, she barely noticed that Jon had started addressing the northern lords.